So today we're going to be talking about the lyrical double bass of Giovanni Bottesini, continued through the works of Ernest Bloch. So to start with, let's have a brief discussion on their backgrounds. Bottesini was born in 1821 in Crema in Italy. Of particular interest to me is the fact that he took up the bass after playing violin to get into conservatory in Milan. Interestingly, as well as the fact that he also considered the bassoon as an ulterior instrument to gain entrance. Um, he, of course, wrote a lot of great bass works, but also wrote wonderful, wonderful operas, including the first one, Christopher Columbus, basically translated to English. Um, but he really excelled, of course, as we know, as bass players on the double bass, earning him the name the Paganini of the double bass. In essence, Bottesini's style really is derivative of vocal music in the sense that he took lyrical arias from operas, from all sorts of other great Italian bel canto composers, and would play arrangements of them for the double bass, really giving the bass a virtuosic side, but also a very, very lyrical side as well. Examples like Lucia de Lammermoor, Il Puritani, and Beatrice de Tenada. Um, a good other point with Bottesini as well is the fact that he always is thinking about the voice first and foremost in his own writing for bass, but of course, as an opera composer, often his works aren't played as much now, but he was relatively popular in Italy in his lifetime. Next, talk about Ernest Bloch. Very different life and a little bit later time period than Bottesini. Bloch grew up Jewish, and Jewish works are his mainstay and really what he's known for into the 21st century. He studied composition in Germany. He moved to Paris. He had interactions with Debussy. They had letters, though interestingly, Debussy was not particularly a fan of Bloch in his own private notes. Bloch wrote an opera there, Macbeth, which is a large work. He was really hoping to get a lot of fame out of it, and it never really came to fruition, but he did learn a lot of compositional techniques. He went back to Geneva, and then eventually he would go to America in a long story about following a touring ballet theatrical performance that ended up getting canceled, where he was stranded and he sort of fell in love, and his music had kind of superseded him, and people reached into their pockets and helped Bloch stay, and he quickly gained a repute in New York City. Um, he would bring his wife there, uh, and they would settle there fully in 1917 in the midst of the First World War. Um, he was a teacher at Mannes, and eventually, after his time in New York kind of wound to a close, he looked west, elsewhere, to become the director of the Cleveland School of Music. Um, it was in these time periods that we get the most famous works for Bloch, the great Jewish cycle works, which includes Shlemo, the great cello work. After this period of great artistic production in Cleveland, a falling out with the conservatory led him to look to even further Western areas, ultimately landing in San Francisco, where he founded the San Francisco Conservatory with a colleague who had pulled him from Cleveland. And he would also begin teaching at the University of California, where he had a really, really great deal where he could teach. And then he could, as long as he went to Europe for a big chunk of time, almost 10 years, to compose in Europe and write these great works, where he wrote Sacred Service, his large, almost Jewish style take on the Mass, and then come back to America, where he would then be a teacher at Berkeley for a predetermined time of about 10 years. He spent his final days after retiring from Berkeley, and actually while teaching in Berkeley, at the start of the Second World War, 1941, he moved to the Oregon coast in a little town very dear to my heart, as it's near where my parents live, called Agate Beach. He would live here, his only permanent home, until 1959. Bloch and Bottesini, in a lot of ways, weren't that dissimilar as people and as performers and workers and just who they were. They're both conductors, which is a really interesting point for Bloch. It's often overlooked in the Bloch research, but Bloch conducted many, many major orchestras from London to New York to San Francisco. Bottesini, of course, was a well regarded interpreter of Verdi and Bellini and Donizetti from the great opera houses in Italy. They were really journeymen around the world. These were all around musicians, not just players, not just composers, not just conductors. Bloch played violin very, very well at a young age. Bottesini, of course, being the virtuoso of the double bass. They were excellent composers each, and they both conducted. They were just all around musically inclined. Of course, the interesting thing as well is they were, of course, originally violinists. So they knew the desires, the possibilities of low instruments to stretch into those realms of the high instruments. So, real quick, the musical relations. Character pieces are an interesting thing that comes up between these two. A character piece is a piece of music, usually for solo instrument, expressing either a single mood, martial, dreamlike, pastoral, or a programmatic idea defined by its title. So, Bottesini, in essence, and a lot of his pieces could be considered character pieces. They're really arrangements that are theme and variations that are really bel canto character pieces. He really takes ideas like, for example, the Carnival of Venice, presents a theme and variates it, but it gives this whole character of, well, the Carnival of Venice and the flightness and the theme. So Bottesini's solo bass literature is very much in the vein of a bass character piece. Bloch's vast works for cello are really also character pieces as well. The Jewish character is what's interesting in the meditation or Jewish song or prayer or shalemo. They're all character pieces about studying something in relation to Jewishness. Of course, shalemo, it's the voice of King Solomon, and we get this intense, soulful voice. All of those are character works at heart. So, a note on Jewishness and Bloch, and this is very, very important to get out of the idea that Bloch's music is just, quote, Jewish and nothing else. It's a universal statement. And that's very important to understand in relation to relating Bloch's music to other composers, so we don't pigeonhole Ernest Bloch as just this Jewish composer who really had no influences or thoughts or whatever beyond what he was simply doing. Bloch's Jewish relationship could take up many, many more times what this lecture recital is willing to have. It was estranged, and it was a very complicated relationship. He was raised in a heavy Jewish family. The vast sum of his works that are early, before the Agate Beach years, are heavily influenced by Jewish ideology, Jewish scales, Jewish rhythms, modes, and stuff, including the ones that I'll play today. But that's not the full story to Bloch. He had mixed political views, mixed understanding of the world, mixed philosophical ideas, all of these brewed together, and he really didn't identify as Jewish in a religious sense. He wasn't necessarily a religious Jew. And if you look at the last years of his life in Agate Beach, there's no Jewish writing. All of the programmatic titles are gone. All of the Jewish influences really kind of mostly left the works. They are very, very derivative or inspired, from Bach, and even Schoenberg, where we see 12-tone being used for the first time by Bloch. So the key to sum up the Jewish identity crisis that Bloch had is he's a universal composer. He wrote Western art music. It applies to anybody or anywhere. It was influenced by Jewish themes, life, melodies, in the same way that so much folk music inspired the likes of Chopin or Bartok. So it's an influencer, not a strict identifier. So let's talk about lyricism and the bass. Programming of lyrical works for the bass. I'm going to read this Gary Carr quote because this is important for us as bass players to think about. This is about a recital he was giving in New York, in Carnegie Hall, actually, and this was in the New York Times. Quote, I've specifically chosen a very lyrical program. For many years, whenever I'd play, people would talk about the oddity of a solo bass concert or my technique, but never about the program's musicality, which is, after all, the most important thing. The sound of the bass is very close to that of the human voice. It's very musical. I always loved the sound of the basso cantante in the opera house, and it's that elegance, that lyricism I try to emulate when I play the string bass. Gary Carr. So, really, what we're getting at here is that the bass possesses a huge realm of expressiveness that, unlocked, really is a wonderful element besides just virtuosic playing. And so, that's what we're sort of getting at in this comparison between Bloch and Bottesini, that these four pieces, excuse me, all have a deep lyrical underpinning that the bass is really, really suited for. So let's talk about physics real quick on lyrical bass music. It's just sort of my argument for playing lyrical music on the bass as opposed to maybe something else. Bass is an elongated string length. This, of course, equals a larger vibrating area, which is really intrinsic to a richer sound. Um, I'm a big fan of different types of wood and the study of wood and how wood relates to sound. The larger capacity for the instrument simply means that there's just more colors for it to come out. The size, how the instruments are made, the ways they're made, the variations of corners, the types of wood, all of these contribute to really rich resonance and overtones, and really make every bass unique. And so every voice is even more unique because there's just so much more material to work with, even in comparison to something like a violin. So the key points between the two here, um, Bloch's works for cellos continue this just rich tradition of Bottesini's lyrical bass rap. Of course, Dragonetti played Beethoven's cello sonata, and that's kind of the first really established example of us taking cello literature and giving it uh, a bass flair. They fashioned these works are in a similar fashion that are very vocal lines, and we're going to discuss that in a bit. Um, Bloch discovered that setting traditional songs for solo instruments would allow him to represent Jewish traditions without recourse to texts in Hebrew, which he and many of his audiences did not fully understand. He thus changed Shalemo during the early stages from a work for singer with Hebrew text to a cello solo with orchestral accompaniment, creating, in effect, a song without words. And this is the real thrust for the Bloch pieces here, especially to bring them to bass. These are music and music first. The song elements, the Jewish elements, these are all secondary to it just being expressive lyrical works. Um, Bottesini used operatic music and arranged variations as a continuation upon the main theme to show off the bass's ability and, of course, to be lyrical. A lot of the variations are, in essence, lyrical building blocks. So the big point to all this, the music reference point is always the human voice for Bottesini, and this is carried on through Bloch. So we're going to talk about the first two examples. We're going to compare the vocal music of Bloch's prayer and Bottesini's elegies to comparative vocal music that each one of them wrote individually. So for prayer, let's talk about the piece real quick. It's a part of the Jewish life, or excuse me, from Jewish life. There's three pieces in the work: prayer, supplication, and Jewish song. They're all inspiration of the human voice comes through these, and all rely really heavily on lyricism. They're very declamatory and linear progression and focus on certain intervals for colors. So we're going to see this very heavily in the minor Phrygian second and that augmented second here, in establishing this Phrygian harmonic mode, Phrygian harmonic minor mode, excuse me, for the Bloch works. Prayer was premiered by Hans Kindler, who is the cellist who also premiered Shalemo. And it's really the big Bloch piece for these Jewish sets of pieces. It should also be noted that this piece is played by bass players all over the world. Gary Carr in that recital in New York played prayer after he played Bottesini's elegy. So this work is beloved by bass players, is beloved by a lot of different instruments because it's very beautiful and the lines really work together. So let's go on here to the sacred service. So sacred service is really take on the liturgical form from like the Catholic Mass in a Jewish context. It's a massive work, massive work. It's written in Hebrew. It has a solo baritone, chorus, and a full orchestra. But it's intended again with this universal idea to translate to everybody. It's not just a Jewish word. So, in essence, it's a universal mass is a better way to think about it. The baritone part is what we're going to look at. It's a similar tonal range to the cello or bass, and that gives a good way to compare prayer to this and other vocal works. So here we have some of the text from prayer and the text from sacred service. The first idea is what this blue circle is showing is the continuity of lyrical development. The upwards trend into the stepwise down and then back up. We see this similar lyrical idea in both of these examples from each of the pieces. And that's a really important lyrical stepwise progression upwards and a gentle coming down with a few interesting little steps. So this is the very, very good vocal writing that Bloch is using in both pieces, but you can see the inspiration from sacred service below. The rhythmic idea too is the same in the cello and the voice writing for these melodic passages. There's a focus on a mixing of short into long, develop rhythmic intensity towards the phrase end. It's all very clean. It's very good part writing. It just makes a lot of sense. The red circle shows the similar pattern of leap into stepwise motion and this falling pattern. This big leap into this descent or into some sort of similar pattern is really common in Bloch's writing, and it's a good vocal technique. It gives energy, it gives direction, it gives purpose to something, and then there's this gentle falling back that allows the text to progress forward. Let's look further in the next slide here. The blue circle and the red circle are this continuation of the similar melodic development. So we're seeing that in both cases with the ornamentation and how the blue circle continues this by adding rhythmic intensity. The contours below as well are really similar. You can see this again, this long descending line down, and just embellished further with some variations up or variations down just to add emphasis and interest. The big point though, the cello works rely on the voice as the basis and the soul, but build it with more variety as the instrument allows. So look at these lines some more, and we can see just how carefully written they are in the sense that there's just so much direction and intention about where they're going. So let's look at Elegy number 1 and Romanza una voce a me by Bottesini. So I won't discuss too much about the background of these works by Bottesini compared to Bloch, just for time's sake, as I'm going to assume most of the audience is aware of Bottesini's Elegy works, and we'll talk about Elegy 3 a little bit more later. The Romanza is a piece written for soprano, double bass, and piano, and it's mostly just this beautiful love song, and very much in the bel canto style. So let's look at the text, as that's the real thrust of what's going on here. The unfortunately text that I could find is actually all the manuscript, which makes this a little tricky in terms of the analysis component. But let's look at these primary themes. They both establish a motive and rhythmic identity, this compound meter, really quickly. And the simplicity here of the initial theme is what sets them up in this really beautiful sense. The move from a simple opening line or this arpeggio or just something simple, a simple scale, simple setup, into some emotive leap is really the quintessential sort of bel canto setup for any sort of vocal writing. The bass simply embellishes this line with ornaments or some other directional intensity. So that's an example one we can see on the top left, and the bottom. I think that's very clear, especially with if you look at how the the elegy in the bottom has this beautiful setup, simple scale down, rising, ornamentation, big league up. Some of in the una voce, we have the setup where the arpeggio comes down, and we have this really big leap up, and then we can add that expressivity downwards. So example 2 shows a similar propensity for motion in arpeggios with the compound meter that allows more lyrical flow to continue. And that's a nice trait that Bottesini really likes to exploit. Um, they start and end on the same pitch, above the median, below the dominant, yet divert through essentially neighbor pitches. When you look at these little more moving lines in above and then below in the elegy example, you can see how they're very similar. How the direction is varying but still tight. It's still around a single kind of pitch center that gives the voice a center to anchor on. It gives the bass the similar property as well. So let's move on here. Um, we're going to look at this again in relation to these blue circles. And you can see the arrows I've placed in here. So the bass line is built in a similar fashion to the top line from the vocal work with this bel canto style chromatic embellishments going up. You see these big, big lines pushing until we get to this big moment. And this is all vocal writing. This is just tension, 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 release in the very, very stepwise progression that just gets the audience going and gets the player going. And whatever it is, whoever's playing, excuse me, you can really get the sense of where it's going. Um, in the same with the elegy, we have these moving lines, moving notes, excuse me, that go up to this high point, and then we get the big set down from there. That's a very operatic technique, and it's really crucial to understanding Bottesini, especially. The neighbor tones and so forth, they give this element of stasis in the red circle here after the climatic point. And that's also a nice trend that we see in Bottesini, is this establishment of some sort of like resolution and calm afterwards. There's not just punch you in the face all the time like this is Wagner. So let's go on and listen to the pieces. And now we'll look at meditation Eberique and elegy number 3. So let's look real quick at this meditation in terms of what's going on uh, in Bloch's life. This was written in Cleveland, produced the work in 1925. It's a really great example overall, as a whole, of Bloch's writing style of this Western meets Jewish harmony. So let's look at the scale real quick, this Phrygian dominant mode. This gives it the real Jewish feel. Given here in C, we have C, D flat, E, F, G, A flat, B flat, C. So the key, of course, is that lowered Phrygian. And that combined with the overall minor mode, you get this big accentuation of, well, the Jewish identity. And Bloch really, really works it in this piece. The form overall is similar to Bottesini. It's compartmental. It's also this sort of open, wide ABA form where we see the compartmental pieces, each theme and each development of the theme are compartmentalized, but the open form is ABA. Harmony itself is really as expressive, its character, it has that real Jewish flair like we just talked about. And again, we have this stepwise flow with broken ornamentation to really set up the linear character. So as we move on, let's look at elegy number 3. That's how I get into this after the first elegy. The third of the 3 elegies, all written about 1880, actually right around when Bloch was born. The elegy definition from Grove is a setting of a poem or an instrumental piece lamenting the loss of someone deceased. So again, this is the classic example of Bottesini's mix of vocal linear elements and fast arpeggiated flourishes to make it virtuosic ABA form. Transitions in the opening from minor to this major ending, this classic trope of bel canto writing that Bottesini just loves to exploit. So let's look at it. So here's the top, we have the meditation, and the bottom is the elegy. So what we see is this similar rising character, the similar lines that drive upwards. You can see, of course, that the elegy has this more stepwise, bass-friendly writing in terms of where the harmonics and the notes of easy notes to play are located. Meditation, though, it's the same idea. We have this big up, and then we come gently down, and we settle on a pitch, and then we develop it. Seeing that sort of like pause that occurs in that third measure, where the in the meditation we have a diminuendo, and in the Bottesini there's that quite little 16th note rest. The ornamentation too can't be understated. This is the real flair and character of the work, and Bloch gives the Phrygian mode, the Jewish feel, this like the big punch, and then Bottesini gives it that wonderful Italian ornamentation that we so know and love for Italian music of the bel canto. So overall, you can see the real similar characteristics and how these lines are just formed. The upward motion, it comes back down, the development within that, the rhythmic intensity moving towards this sort of point, and then we have that big leap too, where it goes back up. That lift to then give us into this downward lyrical element in the Bottesini, and below you have that little chromatic step in the Bloch. It's really drawn out. There's also those chromatic elements and the stasis moments. But the pitches too, the embellishments, as you see in the Bottesini below, all are actually like embellishing back up to the general lyrical downward flow from D, D flat, C to B flat. So again, it's you can really look at it the same characteristic as the Bloch in these big flow movements downwards. So let's get into the little meaty, gritty parts later. The second theme in these works, it returns at the end. We have this parallel structure going on that we'll look at the very end, but the parallel structure is highly important. We get this same theme coming back to really round out the work. This is kind of the main point, the main theme, blah blah blah, that they both return to, and it's presented after this introductory theme. So let's look first at the contour again. We have this leap followed by stepwise motion, as I've talked about. So important to the lyrical writing of both of these. Bloch's theme is AABB form. Bottesini takes the same text and traced F major chord, however both sound familiar in their contouring. So you can kind of see how the contour is the same in the meditation, right in that red arrow down to the one in the elegy. That phrase too, that red bar is underneath. You can see how that, again, it's just like the opening. So let's look at the blue line. That's where we're looking at this big thematic progression. And this is the sort of like the emotional energy that we're going for both of these. The Bloch above, really big drive to that high G flat, where it just comes down from there. But that's the real big scream and powerful moment, and you have a nice controlled descent. Same in the Bottesini. It's not quite the same in the sense that the descent is not so powerful. You actually get kind of this flautando. You get the harmonics at the high end of the double bass, and that serves as the sort of energetic virtuoso point in the whole section, really. But that's where you can see where the themes and the actual form is really similar to how they're getting their lyrical section to go and then come down from that. I think also of note too is just you can see how similar the structure is. The rhythmic structure is really similar. The impetus, the drive up to that top note, and then the slowing down occurs right in the measure after the top note. At the start of the third system in the elegy below, and at the end of the third system in the meditation above. Really similar to how these themes are going about what they're going about. So let's continue looking more here at the next example. Again, this is all about contour building. Up to a clear high point and fall down. Same thing. The red mark there shows that clear high point, the red circle. The rhythmic development towards the apex is really similar. Bloch's using that dotted run. Bottesini uses the triplets to push this towards the animando and so forth. It reaches the apex, and then you get this really beautiful, powerful this time roll back down to the arpeggios. So you can really see the sort of characteristics happening between the two in the context of where the line is going, and that high point again, really apparent there. I love this section in both of the works, as you'll hear it. It's just really powerful, really bombastic, really soulful, but it's so controlled in the animando and the acceleration in the Bloch to get to that point. So let's look at the very final bit of the piece here, um, the ending. So we see this return of the second more lyrical and vocal theme in the stepwise fashion downwards that it's going to do. Both works copy this identically. It's this, they know that they've nailed this really vocal line, this really setup, and you just want to continue this nice and elegantly, step, step down. And that really works well. And it also works for the voice, repetition, repetition, and then also the slow gradual descent. Again, we have those ornaments, and I think especially since that's being brought out so much here at the end, and it's so important to the theme, it's another point to look at them. They really accentuate the line, really help drive it to where it's going. In the Bottesini on the right and the Bloch on the left, you can see how it really sets up that C in the Bloch and lets that step down finally to its B flat. In the Bottesini, it's in the middle of the line. There's also leaps that next line after the red line circle to that D as well. Those are all just really keeping the character going, keeping some energy, but also keeping the focus on those very, very poignant notes. And of course, the ending of both of these is just so serene. The Bottesini on the right flies upwards to probably really the highest notes you'll ever see written for any bass literature piece anywhere. The false harmonics, an octave higher than the traditional highest octave G and D, excuse me. Those are really screaming up there, but they're done so quietly, and the piano's quiet, and everything just very, very calm ending. And it's the same in the Bloch on the left, where we have this line down, the final Phrygian statement resolving it to that B flat that is just longed for, and he drives that intensity all the way there, and it's really sublime. Both of them are sublime, sublime finishes to these very emotionally intense and lyrical works. So let's, without further ado, give them a listen. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to the comparison between Bloch and Bottesini as well as the works themselves, because I find them all sublime and just wonderful and really, really, really work well on the double bass as expressive pieces of music. Hope you come to see that the writing here between Bloch and Bottesini for the double bass is really not that dissimilar. Thank you very much.